Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Community Table Series presented by Anthem Medicaid. Today with us, we have Amanda Martin from Center for Women and Families and myself, Danielle Lortz from the Coalition for the Homeless. And today we're going to be talking about housing protections for persons impacted by domestic violence and sexual assault. So I'm going to share my screen. Please bear with me. All right, so we're going to go over our goals for today's training. And what we're hoping is that you'll be able to identify what VAWA housing protections are and who they apply to, best practices to help consumers access the housing protections available to them, and then any tools and resources that you can use to help access VAWA protections. Okay, so first, what is VAWA? VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act, and it provides housing protections to those experiencing and surviving domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. So as a HUD grantee, you have a housing program, you are protected under certain protections from VAWA. And in 2022, there was a reauthorization of VAWA and HUD's notice to public regarding enforcement authority and procedures. And it kind of helped tighten up complaints about violation of VAWA rights and who it could be filed with at the HUD Fair Housing Office. Okay, so who do VAWA housing protections apply to? Those that are eligible for VAWA are for applicants and tenants of HUD housing programs. And then it's not limited to women and available to all without regard to sex, gender identity, or sexual orientation. And the key point is to making sure that they're a victim or survivor of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And then other consideration, guests and unreported household members and live-in aides may be available to protections, but kind of more limited. Guests are protected by the right to report, and a tenant can request protections if a live-in aide is a victim, including an emergency transfer for the household, and individuals affiliated with the tenant who face adverse housing decisions as a result of VAWA violence may be protected. All right, so these are all of the covered housing programs for HUD, housing for the elderly, so Section 202, Section 811, supportive housing for persons with disabilities, HOPWA grants, ESG grants, CoC grants, Rural Housing Stability Assistance Program, home programs, and the Housing Trust Fund. They're also covered under multifamily rental housing. So if you have a grant of anyone with Section 221, Section 236, public housing, Section 8, project-based rental assistance, and Section 8 SROs. Other programs, HUD may also identify additional covered housing programs in the future. And right to report, VAWA protects your right to report crime and emergencies from your home, regardless of whether your housing is assisted under a covered housing program. All right, so we're going to move into VAWA housing protections. So the role of the service provider. Amanda, would you like to speak to some of the roles that you all use at the center?
Yes, definitely. So we both on our DV team and our SA team, we deal with non-residential clients. So on the DV team, they deal specifically with the court advocacy. And the biggest thing with our court advocates is that they cannot give legal advice. So at that point, they do referrals to legal aid or help get survivors to those resources for that, for the legal pieces. But the biggest thing our advocates do is help the survivors know what their rights are within VAWA, and the different resources that they have available. Our advocates also help with just outlining how like court will play out and how different resources, what everything looks like within that. So hopefully there aren't any surprises for the survivor as they reach out to resources or they go through different court proceedings for different things. Yeah, so they just kind of lay out what those options are and help so that the client has a very clear understanding of what to expect and what their options are, so they can hopefully make the best decision for them.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Amanda. All right, so VAWA Housing Protections, it protects clients from any adverse decisions regarding assistance because of their experience with DV. It protects them from denial of admission or assistance, eviction, and termination of assistance. So we can't evict a client for experiencing DV. Emergency transfers, it allows clients to request an emergency transfer, and we will talk a little bit about that at the end of this training. It helps them with lease bifurcation, which we will also discuss here in a moment, to be able to report and to self-certify that the domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking has taken place. And in order to report, do a self-certification, there is a HUD form for that. It's HUD 5382. Okay, so assistance denial, termination, eviction, we're all curious about this. So we cannot deny any admission or assistance, evict or terminate assistance to someone affected by VAWA because of the violence or abuse committed against them, or reasons related to VAWA. So eviction history, bad credit history, criminal history. So if they were involved in those things because of their abuse, then we can't deny or evict from that experience. Survivors must have the option to stay even if there has been criminal activity directly related to VAWA violence or abuse. So it may be that someone wants to stay in their unit after someone has come in and like broke the door down. They have the right to stay if they want to. Protections apply to the residents, tenants, and household members living in the unit. And then HUD refers to these protections as VAWA's core housing protections. Okay, before a discrimination happens, educate clients about their rights under VAWA. And then after a possible incident of discrimination, so we think we maybe have denied or evicted someone potentially because of their DV experience, we would problem solve immediate housing solutions, assist with a fair housing complaint or advocacy with the housing provider, and refer to legal services, and then connect clients to another service. I apologize, I clicked on something and now I can't see. All right, sorry. Okay, so emergency transfers are available for households in a covered housing program if the occupant expressly requests the transfer, believes a threat of imminent harm from further violence if they were to stay in the same unit, if the sexual assault occurred on the premises during the 90 calendar day period preceding the date of the transfer request. A safe unit is a unit that occupant believes is safe, even if the housing provider has a differing opinion. So maybe they're going to move back to where another perpetrator lived, or they experienced sexual assault too, but it feels safer to them than what it was in the moment. And then for those with Section 8 housing choice vouchers, the survivor must be able to move with continued assistance. Okay, so after a sexual assault or DV incident, educate clients about their rights under VAWA, and then refer victims or refer them to the victim advocates for safety planning. And so Amanda, that's kind of where you would come in, correct?
Yes, exactly. So referring them to the center so that our advocates can do those safety plannings and get them connected with any resources that they need. Yes.
Perfect. And then if they're not requesting an emergency transfer, problem solve immediate housing solutions. So that is something to coordinate again with Amanda or anyone that is working for the victim advocates, so that everybody's on the same page, and it kind of goes into the safety planning. Assist with a fair housing complaint or advocacy with the housing provider if discrimination has happened. Refer to legal services so that they can be protected, and then connect clients to any other services. And again, that's where the teamwork and the collaboration of working with the victim service provider will definitely help you all. And then if you feel that discrimination has happened or the process isn't working, you can always contact the HUD local office. Amanda, do you have anything to add as well about collaboration?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered everything. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so bifurcating a lease means that a housing provider removes a household member from a lease in order to evict, remove, terminate occupancy rights, or terminate assistance to a household member who engages in criminal activity directly relating to VAWA violence abuse. So you may choose to do this in accordance with federal, state, or local laws and requirements of the housing program. And if the household member who was removed was the eligible housing program tenant, the housing provider must give those who remain a reasonable time. Reasonable isn't really defined. Here we're saying usually 90 days, seems reasonable, to establish eligibility under the same program, under a different program, or to find other housing. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the emergency transfer plan, and our providers will be very excited to hear that we have taken out the requirement for them to pay for a hotel, as many people have expressed to us that they do not have the funding sources to help assist clients in a hotel. So here's the documentation required for you to request a VAWA emergency transfer plan here in the Louisville Continuum of Care. So we need an emergency transfer request or any law enforcement or administrative agency that documents the incident, and then a statement which the tenant must sign along with the signature of an employee, victim service provider, an attorney, etc., from whom they sought the assistance in addressing DV. And then also any other statement or evidence that the agency has agreed to accept. And again, remember, clients do have the right to self-certify. Okay, and then the process, you must have attempted to transfer the tenant to another unit within the same program, or the agency has attempted to transfer the tenant to another program within the same agency, or the agency does not have the resources or capacity to rehouse the tenant internally. The agency must contact the Common Assessment Team supervisor to request the tenant be added back to the housing referral list. Again, it will take about a reasonable amount of time. We're going to say around 90 days in order to have a special circumstance meeting. The coordinated, the Common Assessment supervisor will then reach out to people for the special circumstances committee, and then they will make a vote on where to put the person in line. Also, if you do not have the resources or capacity to rehouse the tenant internally, please contact the victim service provider. So in our case, this would be Center for Women and Families. Amanda, do you want to talk people through what to expect with that?
Sorry, I lost my controls to be able to unmute myself for a second. So anytime, so whenever a referral is made for someone who's in a domestic violence situation that needs housing, we definitely have, they go through the lethality screen to see if they meet criteria for our shelter. And if we don't have the space available, they definitely look to put them in a hotel for 24 hours or transfer them to other shelters as they have space and availability as well. So it just depends on what is available with us and surrounding areas. Yeah.
And with that as well, I would also say that clients can transfer out of the CoC if needed or if they want to. And in that case, you would reach out again to Carrie for the common assessment supervisor, and then contact someone at the CoC as well. In this case, it would be Ashley or Brandy would be who you would reach out for an CoC transfer. Okay, so we expect that all agencies will develop their own internal record keeping system of transfers, no matter what type of transfer it is. And in this case, keeping track of emergency transfers or any transfers, you may be asked to produce this information during CoC monitoring visits. So whenever Ashley reaches out to you, she may ask for those, for the documentation, just to ensure that it met all of the expectations. And then confidentiality, we just want to talk again about how important confidentiality is when it comes to the rights of those experiencing domestic violence, sexual assault, all of that. So make sure that you are keeping any information confidential when submitting any requests. Okay, and this talks about the timing of emergency transfer. And I will say, when we were working with TA providers, they really wanted everything to be immediate. And in a perfect world, we would have immediate availability for clients within 24 to 48 hours to be able to transfer them. However, we live in a community and in a system that lacks resources for us to be able to do that. So we just want it to be done in a reasonable amount of time. Again, maybe around 90 days. It may take longer, may take, maybe sooner, but we'll say an average of 90 days. And we cannot guarantee that a transfer request will be approved either within our CoC or outside, or how long it will take to process a transfer request. All right, I think that is everything that we have. And I thought we could just take the rest of the time for people to put in into the chat any questions, so that while we have Amanda here and her expertise on serving this population, please enter your questions in the chat and we will try to answer them. So I have a question here that says, in a couple, if both household members were eligible for PSH, and if we do a lease bifurcation, are we obligated to continue serving both members of the couple? I believe the answer is yes. Ashley or Amanda, do you have?
I think it is yes, because I have encountered a situation on the front line before where someone invoked VAWA and the perpetrator was still with them.
If they're both eligible for PSH, yes. Thank you for that question. Sorry, it is very loud outside of my office. Does anybody else have any other questions or any scenarios which you thought would be great? Okay. Thank you. If our PSH program requires chronic homelessness and the victim wasn't head of household and didn't have documentation of chronic homelessness before entering housing, the victim cannot remain in our PSH after a reasonable time. Yes, you would need to work on getting them verified for another housing opportunity, another housing program through PSH. And if they're not eligible for any PSH, then they would need to work on you would need to work with them to find a different housing opportunity. We'll go with 90-ish days. It doesn't have any clear term, but and then what if there are children involved? I think it's the same, but I would need to research that. Amanda or Ashley, do you have any insight to if children change it?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
I honestly don't know either. We don't deal a whole lot with homelessness in general, outside of like domestic violence situations.
Yeah. Thank you, Amanda. Okay. Okay, so this might be a question for you, Amanda. If children are involved, would a CPS report be appropriate?
Depending on the situation, yes. So whenever someone calls a crisis line, we definitely go over the limits to confidentiality, and one of those being child abuse or neglect. So if a child hears domestic violence, like banging and things like that, it doesn't necessarily mean that we would need to call CPS. But if a child witnesses violence, especially more dangerous violence, like if a weapon is involved and things like that, or if one of the parents was holding the child while the perpetrator assaulted them, then yes, we would have to make a CPS report.
Thank you, Amanda. And then we have another question here. Any advice for navigating situations where a survivor is offered numerous housing opportunities, but is holding out for one specific type of housing that isn't available? And sometimes this continues for many months. Do you have experience with that, Amanda, when you all are trying to house survivors?
Yes. And so unfortunately, it's one of those situations where we at the center, we try to empower our survivors. So we give them the resources, and it's 100% up to them to use those resources. It's a very frustrating situation because as helpers, we want to help, we want to see the survivors succeed and to use those resources. But if they are choosing not to, at that point, we have to look at, okay, what are the things we can control? What are the things we can't control? And we cannot control if someone uses the resources that are being presented to them. So there's not really much you can do in that scenario, unfortunately.
Amanda, do you think it's appropriate in those situations, like it's taking longer than the 90 days that we're kind of allowed to keep someone open? Is it appropriate for a housing provider to say we've extinguished all options, or like have that frank conversation?
I think that's completely appropriate. I know on our side, we've had to do the same. We've had to, like, these are the parameters of our service. This is what we've presented to you. And at this point, it's up to you to use that. But we have to operate within those parameters because there's so many people who need help, both from your agency and ours. And that's a hard thing, I think, for people within this, what we do within this field to do is to set those boundaries and set those parameters, but it is a reality that we have to do.
Thank you, Amanda. And we have in the chat, that was incredibly frank. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
All right. Do we have any other questions? I wish there was a way to let people come off mute, and I'm just not technologically advanced to do that. So I apologize. We have to put things in the chat. Ashley, do you have anything from monitoring or a specific instance from the CoC within the last year that you think would be helpful for us to problem solve and talk out?
No, but I think I can unmute people if you want me to go through and do that. Like you can allow them to talk, so I'll do that and maybe someone will have a question.
That would be great. Thank you, Ashley. Oh, here we go. I think you guys should be able to come off mute if you all have questions. So feel free to come off mute and ask any question.
This is Sarah. And can I just ask, what are, you talked about that there's kind of an emergency transfer committee that maybe meets or that you can request information. And just was wondering more about that process or who is part of that. Like, I understand that we can say we need to find another housing resource for someone, but when we know that those housing resources are limited and that really in the end, me saying call this number or meet with this person is just going to end up with someone who's a victim of domestic violence ending up homeless after a certain amount of time, you know, knowing what interventions we can take. I'm just wondering kind of what kind of community coming together to see the resources that I might not know about look like.
Yeah, so from the CoC side, we just had a recent VAWA issue where they were experiencing domestic violence and we're in a PSH program. And so we had to, it's basically the special circumstance committee, Sarah, with the coordinated entry. And we kind of reviewed to move them to the top of the list or not.
Okay.
And then in terms of resources, the CoC recognizes we don't have a ton. There was a VAWA committee, emergency transfer plan committee that went by the wayside. I believe that Ashley and Brandy are deciding to move forward with that later on. For folks who don't know, tomorrow is my last day at the coalition, so I'm not, I can't speak to the CoC future circumstances, but Amanda may have better recommendations of what to do with clients while we're waiting in the meantime, if there are any resources available. Amanda, can you speak to what resources are available to those experiencing DV that are in need of shelter or housing if the center is full? I think we lost Amanda. I'm sorry, guys. Oh, she can unmute. There you go, Amanda. I got you.
Okay, I was trying. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't unmute. I think unfortunately we're in the same situation where there is very limited housing resources. We have an advocate who one of her job functions is to continuously call and find resources. I mean, so we're trying to update a resource list as often as we can. So honestly, sometimes the best thing to do is to call our crisis line and just ask one of our crisis response counselors if they have any resources available. Yeah.
And I'd like to offer up something. This is Greer Hannon from St. Vincent de Paul. We have a joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing project, which is DV specific. And one thing we've been able to do with the transitional housing side of it is if someone already has, for example, a PSH voucher and is in a unit and experiences DV in that unit and is fleeing, like really doesn't feel safe to stay in that unit another night, we've worked with coordinated entry to go ahead and move that person into transitional housing until they can take that PSH voucher that they still are entitled to and find another unit in the community, because we all know it can take 30, 60, 90, 120 days sometimes to find a new unit in the community. So we've done that a few times. That said, a lot of survivors, you know, find out that it's a congregate site-based transitional housing project and that there's very limited storage there for their belongings, and they assess in terms of their own preferences and their own safety, that their choice is not to enter into that environment. And we respect that choice, but there have been some people who did feel so threatened that they were willing to come into a congregate site-based facility, and they worked out some type of storage option for their belongings, and it served them well so that they could hold on to that PSH voucher and use it.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Greer. That was very helpful. Do we have anybody else with any questions today or scenarios that you'd like to talk through? Okay, well, seeing none, we just would like to thank Amanda and the Center for Women and Families and Jane, who also helped present this month for our special domestic violence series. We will return to the regularly scheduled bi-weekly trainings on Wednesdays for the community table. Again, we'd like to thank our partners, Anthem Medicaid, for making this possible. And we will see you all soon. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.